It's a great, great pleasure for us to welcome Dr. Rowan Williams as our first speaker of the day. In many ways needs no introduction. He actually connecting with last night's Welsh theme. Dr. Williams was born in Swansea in Wales. He studied at Cambridge and Oxford. He's had a long career in both the church and in academia, again, both in Cambridge and in Oxford. Probably known to most of us as the former Archbishop of Canterbury. He stepped down from that position in 2012 and became the Master of Magdalene College here in Cambridge, and took up his seat in the House of Lords as Lord Williams of Oystermouth, which I've just found out is a little village on the Mumbles Peninsula just west of Swansea, a very beautiful little spot, Dr. Williams tells me. But also, in addition to his work in academia and the church, he's known as an outstanding thinker, writer, scholar, teacher, involved in many, many different arenas of theological, ecumenical, and educational work. Authored over 2,000 books. Sorry, 2,000 would be a little too many. But even the most prolific author in areas of philosophy, religious engagement, spirituality, and also, as we're going to hear today, diversity and equality. But he's also a poet, an accomplished poet, a translator, and speaks and reads a number of different languages, 9 at least, I believe. Rowan, it's an absolute privilege to have you with us at our 150th anniversary. And now over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Harry, for the welcome, and happy birthday. It's a delight to be able to open a discussion on an issue which is really quite complex in all sorts of ways, religion and equality. And part of my own thinking about it was very much shaped by having the task a few years ago of chairing a working party on behalf of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, dealing with precisely this question. Looking particularly at the issue of whether we needed more legal protection for religious rights in this country, dealing with issues around how you balanced the demands of diversity with the particularities of religious belonging and religious community, and so on. We came to the deeply unexciting conclusion that there wasn't very much that the law could do about it that it wasn't already doing, and that in this area, as in quite a lot of other areas, the mistake was perhaps to try to solve what was essentially a cultural problem by legal provision. The issues were not so much about the inadequacy of law as about sets of assumptions which in various ways sent people to unhelpfully inflexible positions on both sides in the absence of a proper culture of discussion around equality. However, I'm not going to spend my time this morning primarily talking about that experience, but scrolling back a little bit further into the question of how religious language and the lives of religious communities have affected human discourse around equality and inequality historically, and what that might have to say to a current cultural and political situation which brings its own, as you realize, very distinctive challenges. And perhaps the first thing to say in this respect is that whatever we may tend to think in our enlightened and secularized Western environment, human equality is not a self-evident given in human understanding. To put it a bit differently, we have learned to think about human equality rather than having it absolutely built into our DNA. We have faced and are still facing a wide variety of challenges to any idea of human equality, each of which we have to learn and think our way through. Just when we think we can perhaps relax and we have arrived at a plateau, some new issue seems to come from left field to challenge us. and those of us who've had anything at all to do with the student community in this university in the last few years will realize that the question of the rights of transgendered people is now where the acute question seems to focus for many people. Equality is not a given. We've learned about it because for human beings to recognize one another as joint participants in a common venture can be quite hard work. Imbalances of power and advantage, imbalances of access to speech and influence, these things are so deeply built in, it seems, to human society, that the notion that we share one project, one human identity, takes some working out. In this context, the religious framework of discourse offers two resources. One is the notion that there is in some sense a common story for human beings. That's to say, the process of our human growth towards optimal human life is fundamentally the same story for anyone recognizable as a member of the human race. And the second, in most religious contexts, is the story of a common origin. We began in the same place. But even with those two resources at work, the common story, the common origin, it's still been remarkably easy for people across the centuries, including religious people of all colorings, to fail to follow through the implications of that, to hold back on the possibilities of mutual recognition, and to entrench exactly those patterns of mutual unrecognizability, imbalance of power, and so forth. Nonetheless, once you have somewhere in the mix of human self-understanding something of a sense of a common story or destiny and a common origin, you will have an element in human thinking that unsettles unthinking tribalism. It becomes that little bit harder to say and to think that what is good for me has absolutely nothing to do with what is good for you. Well, you won't want a complete survey, and you're not going to get one, of the entire history of religion and philosophy of equality. It's a hot day, and my time is limited, and so is your patience. But I'll say just a word about one of the differences that the Judeo-Christian tradition brings into the discourse of the late classical world. It sounds, I realize, academic and abstract. I hope you'll see why it isn't in a moment. The world into which Christianity came with its Jewish heritage was a world in which it was perfectly possible for some intellectuals to argue in favor of human equality, but where it was also taken for granted that there wasn't very much you ought to do about it, or could do about it. So if you were a Stoic philosopher, somewhere around the turn of the first millennium, you might very well say that every human being, everyone who counted as a human being in physical terms, who was recognizable as a human being at that level, had an inner core of spiritual reality which was equal wherever you looked. But that was, so to speak, presented as a rather surprising fact which you would recognize and then, so to speak, move on from, because it was perfectly obvious that that wouldn't work itself out in any immediate practical way. The most egalitarian of Stoic philosophers still kept slaves without losing any sleep over it. Christian discourse, of course, did not immediately end slavery, and there's a lot that could be said about that. What it did, though, was to recast the notion of human equality, not so much in terms of an inner reality that was the same in everybody, but in terms of a distinctive gift which everyone had the capacity to give into the common life. And that slightly more activist sense of equality, that is, an equality of giving into a shared life, begins to shift the balance just slightly. In other words, while Cicero may have lost no sleep over slavery, St. Augustine did. Not that St. Augustine did anything much more about it than Cicero did, but he worried more. Or to put it slightly more benignly, Christianity begins to recognize a problem here, a jarring of registers. It's quite clear that the maximal or optimal form of human community which the Christian Church thinks about is a human world in which everyone is free to contribute to the spiritual and material security of every other. That the interlocking web of activity and gift is what makes a human community sustainable, moral, and so on. In which case, it is odd and challenging if some people appear to be permanently, decisively at the mercy of the agenda of others, if they are owned by others. And from at least the time of St. Augustine onwards, in some ways rather earlier than that, Christian thinkers begin to think about how you might chart the limits of slavery. By the High Middle Ages, for example, St. Thomas Aquinas is already saying there are certain things that cannot be determined by one person for another, certain choices which nobody else has the freedom to make for you. These have to do with sexual partnership and religious commitment. Rather unusual coupling, but basically what Aquinas wants to say is that even if you are a slave in the Middle Ages, your master or mistress has no right to tell you who you can and can't marry or live with, and no right to make you change your faith. That tiny seed of recognition of the limits of slavery is part of what grows into the sophisticated discourse of human rights that evolves from the 16th century to the 21st and is still evolving. All of this, as you can perhaps see, nudges us decisively away from the idea that there is an absolutely fixed gulf between what is true of us spiritually and what is true of us materially. If you're going to talk about spiritual equality, that's not just a hidden and mysterious thing which has no impact on how social relations work out. In order to be the spiritual identity that you are, you need the liberty to give and to receive in the exchange of society. And that, as I say, shifts things just a bit. I've talked so far about slavery in this connection, but of course in the context we're in today, there is obviously an issue about gender equality looming up over the horizon, demanding attention, a peculiarly vocal elephant in the room in this, as I say, in this particular setting. And this is an area where certainly the Christian religious institution has a very mixed history indeed. Partly because, strangely, this is one area where the classical disjunction between the inner and the outer seems to win the day. St. Augustine, once again, can say eloquently that, of course, women are in the image of God as well as men are, and can then go on to explain why women are in the image of God in a slightly different way from the way men are, so that a woman's imaging of God has a great deal to do with how she behaves in respect of a man. And you find that, of course, eloquently summarized eventually in the 17th century by Milton in the famous phrase, "He for God only, she for God in him." Also, the Church, through most of the Middle Ages and later, inherits and absorbs something of that Aristotelian biological mythology, which tells us that women are innately passive and receptive, as opposed to the activity of men. And that, in turn, means that women are less intelligent than men. To do justice to the Middle Ages, they did not mean that women were stupider than men. They meant that female intelligence had about it less of that active, shaping, initiative-taking quality. Women were certainly capable of running things. Formidable queens and abbesses in the Middle Ages would have disabused people of any illusions on that score. But there was something about their intelligence which was fundamentally responsive rather than initiatory. And that's where the difference lay. Interestingly, one of the cliches that's sometimes used about women in religion, you still hear it, is that there's something much more feminine about the contemplative life. There are lots of women mystics, we're told, because women are naturally more contemplative and mystical and receptive and silent and all the rest of it. I don't know that anybody ever tried to check that empirically, and I wouldn't think they'd have much luck with it. But the odd thing is that in the 16th century, people believed exactly the opposite. Women were not capable of contemplation, and they shouldn't be capable of mysticism. Because for real mystical experience and real contemplative piety, you needed a male intelligence, able to rise to the challenge of what God was delivering in spiritual experience, which is why St. Teresa of Avila had such a very difficult time with the Spanish Inquisition. Her autobiography, which is a gem of waspish tact, I think is the best way of putting it, repeatedly returns to the question of why she is, of course, being only a feeble woman, not claiming anything extraordinary, and she defers in her judgment on all important things to theologians, but she would quite like to point out, and so it goes on. So, a lot in the pre-modern history of Christianity has to do with trying to negotiate your way around some very complex qualifications of the idea of the divine image in humanity. And it's fascinating to see how in the 18th century, especially towards the end of the 18th century, when the debate about slavery is coming to a head and becoming a major political priority in Britain, issues around the equality of women are beginning to come up the track at the same time and in much the same way. There's a fine book by the London scholar Joanna Rourke on who counts as human, which looks at precisely those moments in the late 18th century when women begin to write about their experience of being silenced or repressed. And there's one particularly interesting satirical pamphlet which points out that women appear to have fewer rights and less dignity than animals in British society when you looked at the legislation of the time. So it's, as I say, intriguing that at the very moment when a good many Christian thinkers, and they do tend to be Christian thinkers rather than just Enlightenment secularists, when a good many Christian thinkers are beginning to follow through the implications of what they're saying in regard to slavery, there are others around the edge of the room, as it were, putting up their hands and saying, well, while you're on the subject, there is another rather substantial agenda that you're going to need to address before very long, again, in following through the implications of what you're saying. I should say in brackets that I take great pride in being, as Master of Magdalene, the successor of Peter Peckard, Master of Magdalene in the 18th century, Vice-Chancellor of the University, Dean of Peterborough, who in the 1760s, as Vice-Chancellor, set as the subject for a university essay prize the topic, is it lawful to enslave human beings against their will? He had already published a number of pamphlets attacking the slave trade. When he became Vice-Chancellor, he decided he would use his position to advance the abolitionist cause. The essay prize was won by Thomas Clarkson of St. John's College, and the rest, as they say, is history. But what relatively few people know is that the great slogan of the abolitionist movement, wonderfully embodied in the specially designed plate that the Wedgwoods designed for the abolitionist movement, the slogan, "Am I not a man and a brother?" showing the slave with hands raised, beseeching the master. That was Packard's coinage, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And the complementary, as you might say, "Am I not a woman and a sister?" was beginning to be articulated at that period also. Well, the point of this rather hasty historical overview of some of the complexities of at least Christian and Judeo-Christian interaction with the issue of equality, the point of all this is to say that there is in Christian religious discourse, and one could tell a similar story elsewhere, an element which unsettles, as I said earlier, a pure tribalism, a pure particularism that regards the goods of human beings as radically separate or non-commensurable. At the same time, religious reinforcement of various sorts of inequality can be even more toxic than the inequality that people would experience as a matter of course in oppressive settings, because it adds a level of supernatural sanction. And that's why, in today's world, as in the past, you could say religion is both very good and very bad news where equality is concerned. On the one hand, it is potentially profoundly good news, in that it offers, as I said at the beginning, a very robust vision of a common story of human development and a common origin, not to mention a common standing in the eyes of God, at least in some religious traditions. What it is much less successful at is disentangling that vision from the various pragmatic, traditional, and conventional embodiments of inequality that exist, because it is, as I say, a source of sanction for existing power, a source of reinforcement for some unequal patterns, and at its most unhelpful can sometimes, by recommending patience and long suffering to the unequal partner in a relationship, collusive with oppression and with violence. And I mention all that partly because in the work I've done over the years in relation to churches in the developing world, for instance, I've seen a bit of what it means in many African contexts for the Christian church to be simultaneously very good and very bad news for women. In so many contexts, I've seen women's capacity enriched, released, transformatively exercised because of their sense of worth and dignity and giftedness in the context of the church. I've seen mothers' unions in Burundi and Kenya and Congo doing work that nobody else will do or could do, with disadvantaged groups, with child soldiers, with women victims of war and violence. I've also seen the way in which a particular kind of conservative religiosity can simultaneously collude with male violence against women in bits of African society, including African churches, and male neglect of and contempt for women. It's a knife edge, and it's a reminder, certainly for somebody like myself, that the advent of a broadly Christian liberating perspective in traditional society can be simultaneously a reinforcement of those things that most need transforming in that society. Not a simple story, and I wouldn't expect it to be. But again, it's simply a reminder that all of this needs work. Finally, two concluding observations. If I'm right, then the issue of equality, whether it's conceived in terms of gender, sexuality, race, class, whatever. The fundamental issue is, how are people released to give what they can give? How are they able to be the owners of their own action in a way which bears fruit in their relations, social and personal? That's what equality is basically about, not an abstract recognition. And there are some theological resources to help with that. But the second thing, the very last thing to say, is that all of this gives us a kind of hinterland for an issue which has come into focus a bit more in the last 10 years or so, with the publication of that remarkable book by Wilkinson and Pickett, The Spirit Level, which looks at the psychological impact of social inequality, and very simply maps levels of non-well-being in societies across the Western world against their levels of practical inequality, that is, unequal access to common or public goods. Unsurprisingly, the more unequal a society in terms of access to common goods, the less well-being, the more mental health issues are acute. If I'm right in thinking that the basic issue around equality is of access to what allows you to give into the common life, it's not surprising if, when that is frozen or frustrated, the result is a dramatic lack of well-being. And to respond to the challenge that Wilkinson and Pickett pose in that, I think, epoch-making book, which has still not made the impact it ought to on our society and our policy, to respond adequately, we need something of a backstory of why, as I said, equality is not self-evident, needs to be thought through, needs to be worked for, and needs to be linked in with what we have to say about the innate giftedness that we recognize in every human agent, and how that is released to bear maximal fruit. So, a few thoughts for you to respond to, and I'll shut up at this point, but thank you for listening.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Williams. That was incredibly stimulating, plenty of food for thought. We do have a little bit of time for questions, so if you'd like to put your hand up, there's a roving microphone. Please, could you keep your question related to the subject of Rowan's talk?
I just wanted to thank you for speaking this morning so eloquently, and my question's not related to your talk at all, but to ask you, what's a better gig, being the Archbishop of Canterbury or Master of Magdalene? I'm sure they're both equally rewarding, but which one would you say has the edge?
Given that both jobs have about them a strong element of herding cats, and both are essentially about responsibility without power, I think the one I prefer is the one where you can do less damage, which is being Master of Magdalene.
Great. Thank you. Questions, one at the back there, and then one over on this side.
Thank you. I'd just like to ask, really, whether you think the idea of equality really will do the work that you want it to. I'm completely I'm with you on the thrust of everything you said. But I suppose my conviction is that my moral compass is prodding me in the direction of people flourishing in their differences. And to give an obvious example, say the NHS, which I see as a wonderful institution, doesn't seem very much about equality. It's about, from whom according to their ability and to whom according to their need. So it's not about equality as such. And I just wondered whether you think maybe... Yeah.
Good point. And yes, I can only apologize that this is very much the ultra-condensed version of what I want to say on the subject. Of course you're right. That's why I say abstract equality is not the answer. And when I say that what you might call the moral edge and the moral energy here have to do with allowing each to give what they have to give, I think that builds a bit of a bridge there to what you're talking about. And that's why I think it's interesting that in our general rhetoric today, we tend to run together equality and diversity. And for all that that can become yet another cliche, the instinct there is a good one. It's a way of saying equality does not mean homogenization. Diversity does not mean a free-for-all. How do we work for societies, communities in college and university, communities in our wider society, where there is a genuine sense of attention to the particularity of each in the context of common good? And that's the job that needs doing. So that we need, I would say, a probably rather more robust and differentiated view of justice than we sometimes have. Justice as having about it that imaginative, flexible, responsive, appropriate sense of working with what is there. Lots more could be said, but point taken. Someone over there?
Yeah, there's
you.
just one here and then one on the far side, please.
Dr. Williamson, you've used the word tribalism in a slightly derogatory manner, if you mind me saying. I would tend to define a tribe as being maybe a smaller collection of a community, and surely a smaller collection of a community has just as much rights as the larger connection.
Yes, it's a point worth making. I'm not by any means trying to privilege the large-scale human group over the small-scale human group. To talk about tribalism, though, I suppose I'm using a derogatory stereotype. We tend to say tribalism when we mean that sense of belonging, which is nervous, exclusive, privileging where we are over where someone else is. And as a Welshman, I do know something about that sensation. So I might need to find another word than tribalism for that. Tribal identity in the sense of what you might call natural belonging, local loyalty, is important. We're not, I think, as human beings, designed for the mega scale, the global theatre. We learn who we are in local small-scale settings. We speak with a local accent, as it were, even if we think we don't. Received pronunciation, as I've often said, is just another local accent. So it's not that we should be in any sense embarrassed or ashamed of that belonging. The difficulty comes when that belonging makes it difficult for me to recognize, to resonate with the experience of another, when my history of disadvantage or of suffering, of success or of failure becomes a history which justifies me over against every possible other person. That's the risk I'm trying to nail here.
Question just here. Can you wait for the microphone, please? Thank you.
The question of equality is an interesting one. The message of equality of all men in the New Testament is one that is very close to my heart. But that doesn't mean I'm a practicing Christian. How can this and these values be put over to people without them feeling that they have to belong to a religious denomination or tribe? Because many people chuck out the baby with the bathwater.
Indeed, and I'm interested that you use the word tribe there in a way not irrelevant to my earlier questioner's point. And religious tribalism is a massive problem. So what do we say? I guess part of my concern in thinking about these issues is that there's quite a lot in our modern political, social, philosophical framework that does in fact take for granted principles around equality and human rights, which, as I said, we have taken time to learn. And part of how we've learned them is through a religious discourse. You don't have to be religious to say, well, that's actually how we learned them. And even if you feel you want to pension off religion, which I slightly hope you don't in the long run, you can at least say, well, that is one of the stimuli that got us thinking in that way, that unsettled us And I think it's more important to recognize that we've learned that than a lot of people think. I don't know. This is something I keep coming back to in my own reflection on a range of subjects. We're not very good these days at learning about learning. We tend to think what we believe is, it's there, it's self-evident, it's obvious. So if you disagree, then you are my worst nightmare. Look at the way we conduct our political debates these days, here and across the Atlantic. I'm so obviously right that if you disagree, you can barely be human. And you're a pretty fast downward spiral there. So I want us to learn about learning. I want us to learn about how we actually focus, refine, grow into views. And the religious story is part of that. Naturally, I think it is the place where a lot of this discourse is most fully at home, and that the secularist will have a bit of work to do to find another home for it. But if you like, that's the secularist's problem. But I would quite like us at least to see how that process works and reflect on it.
There was a question just here, I think.
Would you agree that most of this, that we're all born equal? You actually said that we all have the same experience in birth, but it's an extension of your tribalism. You're born into a very small society, the family, and it's the fear of the unknown that brings about the problems that we have in the world today of being against a certain group or whatever, because it wasn't in your own immediate experience. You learn from experience. And with global communications today being what they are, our experience is global, but we doesn't come with the understanding. It's a sort of a snippet bit of global experience, and we don't experience it properly to get to know those people.
Yes, indeed. The strange thing is that our global systems of communication these days seem to have created new global forms of tribalism. We invent international tribes rather than just local ones, equally polarized, equally frightened. In the ideal story, and of course this is never exactly how it is, we are born, as I said, into a particular set of belonging, a history, a family, a language. We learn in that experience to take, inch by inch, more risks, recognizing more people as possible partners in conversation. And if we're secure enough in that belonging, we may be more open to extending those horizons and enlarging those conversations. That's the ideal. In practice, because most of us experience fear and alienation at early stages as well as security, we build up fears and mythologies and end up with that anxiety about the stranger that we're so familiar with. So at the heart of this is, I would say, the question of how we work at guaranteeing, in the very earliest stages of human life, an experience of sufficient security and recognition. It's why the work of somebody like Sue Gerhardt is so important. Her book, Love Matters, a lot about the very, very earliest stages of human psychological development in this context, but that would take me off on another hour or so of rambling.
I think we've got time for one last question, right at the very back there.
Thank you, and thank you for a most stimulating talk, in which one of the ideas I took away is that it can take 1,000 years to change ideas. Now, you called your talk, your lecture, Religion and Equality. You talked about Judeo-Christian religion. Sitting in this place and its connections, I'm sorry, I'm too old, so for me it's a connection with women. What have you to say on how we reach to the Muslim women over the next 1,000 years? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, you're quite right to call me to account on the Judeo-Christian bias of what I said, and again, it's the compressed version. But I'm really intrigued by conversations I have actually quite often with a new generation of Muslim women in this country. We have our stereotypes, don't we? And the media reinforce again and again and again and again the stereotype of the Muslim woman. We have a growing number of educated, professional Muslim women. We will meet them every day. In certain contexts, certain bits of this country, we will see a majority of, obviously, visibly practicing Muslim women as the staff of the average business, the average bank, or school, or whatever, routinely. And those are women who are negotiating what a lot of Christian women have had to negotiate in the past, a sense simultaneously that there is something in the religious tradition that actually guarantees their security and their dignity, and yet it is consistently kidnapped by a patriarchal system. I'm intrigued to listen in to the conversations they have, to see what ideas are bubbling away there. There's an increasing literature on this. In fact, a couple of quite recent books published. You may have seen some reviews in the New Statesman in the last few weeks of a new book on exactly this. And I find myself really very hopeful about that. The trouble is we non-Muslims tend to cast the whole thing in terms of one or two iconic issues like the hijab. I've had quite a bit to do over the years with a range of Muslim women professionals of various kinds, most of whom have worn hijab, one or two of them have worn the niqab. After a while, you do begin to see that that's not the issue, that there's a whole complex of much deeper and much richer questions coming up. And if we allow that to be the determining thing, we're going to miss a point in a rather big way. So lots more that could be said there, but it's a very creative moment for that community, as far as I can see and hear. Very creative moment.
Thank you. Sadly, we are running to quite a tight time schedule here, so I can see the organizer at the back looking at me if I run over. I think you'll all agree with me that Dr. Williams has kicked us off with a fascinating talk, but also opened up a whole lot of other questions, follow-up discussion. I hope that even though it's hot and you're going to be enjoying yourselves, you'll follow on those conversations with one another and be able to enjoy the stimulation of really thinking through what are some pretty crucial issues in today's society and absolutely at the heart of what all that Girton stands for, respecting equality and diversity and holding those two together. Thank you very much, Dr. Williams. We're so appreciative. Let's thank